right, and we are at 50, a healthy 50, folks. Welcome. You are in hopefully the right place. You see, as you arrive, you should be looking at a slide that says where you are supposed to be, which is this panel around food systems crisis, strengthening gender equality and resiliency. We'll give it just a couple more minutes. We have a few more trickling in from the waiting room. Feel free to jump on camera. We would love to see you toggling between speaker and gallery view. If you'd wish to do that, you're welcome to do it. Just gonna let a few more people in. We're so glad you're here. Feel free to say hi in the chat if you wish. We'll get started with the panel shortly. Just give it one more minute. So hello, Hannah, Amanda, good to see all of you here. So glad we're here. All right. Let's go ahead, I'd say, and get moving if we will. Let's do that. Folks, welcome. Panel one, our first 60-minute breakout for our synchronous programming. What we've got on tap. One, like I said, 60 minutes together. During the panel, you'll have an opportunity if you'd like to place your questions in chat. And in the last 15 minutes or so, we are going to invite a dialogue. We would love for you guys to come off mute, so be ready for that. For now, you'll all be on mute, but please know we're going to welcome you to come off mute later. And in the interim, your chat questions are welcome. We have a phenomenal panel for you. Two panelists that'll be introduced by our moderator, who I'm going to welcome to take over, and it is Ms. Cristina Manfre. Cristina is the Global Gender Director at TechnoServe, where she is helping to shape the organization's thinking about gender integration, supporting its ability to implement its gender policy in its programs, administrative functions, and organizational culture. She is a gender and development specialist with 10 years of experience improving development organizations' attention to gender issues in economic growth, agriculture, and trade programming. And it is a delight for me to turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Erin, and welcome everybody to the panel. And hopefully you found yourself in the right panel, which is Food Systems Crisis, Strengthening Gender Equality and Resilience. Erin gave us a big plug at the end of the last, at the end of Jemima's keynote. So we're hoping that you are just as excited as we are to be here and tackle this conversation. As you arrive, please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. We want that to be a warm and active space. Tell us where you're joining from, and specifically, not just where you're sitting in terms of city or country, but where are you sitting in your home or your office? I'm at my dining room table, currently looking out at what's a sunny sky here in Chevy Chase, Maryland, just north of Washington, D.C. I'm joined today by two great women. We've had a lot of fun discussing this panel presentation, and I know they're going to bring some good energy to this conversation. We have Dr. Hazel Malapit, a senior research coordinator at the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and Dr. Mary Peabody, Community Economic Development Specialist with the University of Vermont Extension and founding director of Women's Ag Network and the UVM Extension New Farmer Project. So for this hour, we'll be exploring the gender dynamics of our global food systems and what we're learning about the relationship between food systems and gender dynamics in periods of crisis, like the COVID-19 pandemic that we continue to find ourselves navigating. As many of you are aware, either through personal or professional experiences, 2020 and now continuing into 2021, the pandemic has really revealed the ways in which underlying inequalities between women and men limit women's ability to benefit from their participation in food systems. And when we think about food systems themselves, we've had stark reminders of the ways in which men and women participate in growing food, in processing it, and marketing and marketing food crops, and that they remain highly vulnerable to shocks and changes. So I'm excited about this panel and the opportunity for us to chat about this. And what I am particularly looking forward to here is that we'll have a conversation from the perspective of both the US and the global South. So Mary will talk to us about a US context, and Hazel will then take us through the global South. In a moment, I'll turn over the mic to Hazel and Mary, and they'll each present for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, the three of us, and then invite you to join us with your questions. But we want to kick off with a few polls. So Caroline, could I get your help in putting up the first poll? Excellent. So we want to know who we're talking to and who we're sharing this space with. What geographic area is the primary focus of your work or research, or your geographic region of interest? Let's see. We have about 65% of you voting. It's going up quickly. We'll hold it for a couple more seconds. Let's see. Great. I'm going to ask Caroline to close the poll in a moment and show you the results. Let's see. All right. Hopefully you can all see that. 48% of you are your primary focus is in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by Central and South America. Oh, and Mary, we've got a small share of us looking at North America. So I think at least I'll be interested in hearing what we can learn and what you have to share in that respect. And then we have two more polls. So Caroline, if you could go ahead and put up the, oh, maybe you're just saying this. They're the polls. And then Caroline, if you could put up the next poll, that would be great. At some point this year, were you unable to find or purchase at least one food item that is a regular part of your diet? I found it was really hard to get cinnamon and brown sugar Pop-Tarts at one point, which suddenly became a very important part of my diet. Yeah, I think we're all experiencing grocery shopping has changed very much in the last year. And most of you, if we can end the poll and show that, Caroline. Excellent. All right, yeah, an overwhelming majority of you have experienced a challenge in one way or another. And our last poll. When you're ready, Caroline, great. At some point this year, I was unable to work because I was caring for someone in my family. All right, let's close that and show the results. Excellent. I suspect this might have something to do with the overwhelming number of students on our panel, potentially. That'd be great if any of you wanted to comment on the results of this particular poll. I think for some of us, this has been a real constraint in our ability to focus on work. And certainly working from home has brought many different challenges. On and off, you're going to hear some drilling hopefully in the background at my apartment. They're doing some renovations upstairs, and I'm hoping that's not going to be too disruptive. I don't really, they have their own schedule. All right, well, thanks so much, Caroline. We can close that. And then, yes, dogs as well. Thanks, Erin McGuire. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move us forward into the presentation section of our discussion today. And I'd like to invite Hazel to go ahead and load up her screen, or sorry, her slides. And she's going to take us through gendered impacts of COVID-19 with perspectives from the Global South. We can see your slides, Hazel, and you are good to go.
Okay, thank you so much. Hold on, just allow me. I'm just trying to move all the faces. Okay, maybe I can take that away. Away from my screen. Okay, well, thank you, Cristina. So my name is Hazel Malapit, and my work has been primarily around measuring women's empowerment. I'm an economist by training, and I'm primarily trained as a quantitative researcher, but more recently we started doing a lot more mixed methods research, especially around measurement of women's empowerment. And some of the things that I work on are these linkages between empowerment, nutrition, and agriculture, especially in low and middle income settings. Another thing I wanted to say about me is that last year I had a lockdown baby. So I kind of wanted to start with this personal note just to acknowledge that while we are here in the privileged position of having time and resources to connect to each other in this wonderful virtual conference, that we ourselves are also living with gendered impacts in our own lives. Just that, you know, in the same way that other women that we are studying perhaps in our research are. And so apart from losing my care village, I also gained another job in addition to my normal job, which is distance learning tech support, which is a bit of a joke because it's just really more than that for those of you who have stepped into this role as well during the pandemic. So going back to the research, I think we know that men and women in developing countries may not experience this crisis in the same way. And we know that because there may be differences in relative exposures to certain shocks and stressors. There are differences in resilience capacities, differences in decision-making authority in the household and communities and other spaces, as well as different abilities to take actions to either cope or reduce risks or adapt to these shocks and stressors. And so we are kind of entering this pandemic sort of with an expectation that there are likely to be really important gendered impacts. And some of them are listed here. These are not very surprising. Potential loss of control over income as household incomes shrink. There could be different asset dynamics around whose assets get sold first or whose savings get used first to cope with the shocks of income loss, changes in labor allocation as one family member loses their job, another one has to step up and find other livelihoods, the increase in care burden, of course, as you know, children and other care substitutes have sort of disappeared with these lockdown measures. Changes in mobility, of course, who goes out to do essential services affects their risk of exposure, and food insecurity, and how, you know, changes in diets that we talked about that even we ourselves experience. This may not be felt the same way, you know, across all the members of the household. And then finally, increased stress and just the potential for conflict given this situation and being kind of in close quarters at all times without access to other maybe ways of social support. So the potential for intimate partner violence could also be there. So there's a lot potentially that we're expecting could be playing out. And so we have a lot of questions, right? I think what we really want to know is what do we need to do? What interventions work best? What are protective in terms of, you know, protecting from the health and economic losses that are part of the pandemic? And then how can we design these interventions to be gender sensitive? And then finally, what are the differences between sort of these immediate short-run impacts and potentially long-term intergenerational impacts that may require other kinds of interventions? So we have a lot of questions. And of course, the problem is that the usual ways that we have tried to collect data in especially developing countries are face-to-face interviews. And with these, you know, stay-at-home orders, lockdowns, and sort of just travel restrictions in general, this is no longer available to many of us in most settings, and so especially in development settings. And so, can we use phone surveys to substitute as a viable sort of data collection option? Now, there's going to be a lot of caveats here. There are potentially a lot of methodological issues. I think we'll move that discussion to the for later. But just to say that you know, we're very conscious of the digital divide and how many women, especially from vulnerable populations, may not have even access to a phone, and therefore how do you reach them through a phone survey? So that's just one, but there's potentially other sort of issues around privacy and so on that we need to be conscious of. Now, with that caveat, even then we do need to figure out what's going on. So a lot of our surveys that were potentially about to go into the field started to pivot into these phone surveys. And today I'm just going to talk to you about two particular projects that had done phone surveys. This is not by any means the entire range of things we're doing at IFPRI. There's a lot more kind of phone surveys and other data collection efforts going on, but these are the ones that I'll focus on just for today, just to give you a flavor of the kind of results that are coming out. So I'll talk about three surveys in particular. So one in Gujarat, India, where it covered 9 districts. And this is a women-only survey because these are all members of the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. And then in Nepal, in Dang, Nepal, this is more of a rural survey that interviewed both women and men. And then in the Nigeria survey, it looked at both women and men as well, primarily in rural areas in the Kaduna and Cross River states. So all of these surveys, you know, ask the same questions, and they did sort of 20 to 30 minute phone interviews over a couple of rounds. And I think the plan is to do 5 rounds eventually, but there's just kind of early in the process. I think there are like 2 to 3 rounds of data now available. Okay, so what did they find? So I think the big most important takeaway here is that on income loss, this has been pervasive. So 80% of all the households across the 3 surveys, and I think even as the new surveys are rolling out, this has still been confirmed, that a lot of the households are really suffering from this income loss. And I think early in the pandemic, it was primarily urban because this is where the lockdowns were very strictly enforced and all of that. But I think even in the rural areas, this has become, you know, quite widespread. In terms of food security, there's a bit more variation in the experience across the different surveys, but that in general, men reported lower food insecurity compared to women. In terms of the patterns, it tended to follow the patterns of income loss as well. So in India, for example, that covered not just rural women, but other types of women doing other livelihood activities in the urban areas and non-agriculture, they were the ones who were experiencing greater food insecurity. On coping strategies, I think we had expected that households will use a combination of things, but primarily they relied on savings, using up savings and borrowing money to deal with an income loss. And this is kind of consistent with findings in the literature that the households tended to protect the assets that were important in the main livelihood, so they would dispose of that last. So maybe in these early days, we're not quite seeing we're not quite seeing those coping strategies come up as important as the others. But in India, women said that they actually consumed less to cope with income shocks. So that was very interesting. Like I said, the sale of the assets was not as high as expected. Now, on water insecurity and access to ag extension, there were some also really interesting sort of common threads. One is that with the health concerns around the transmission of the virus, you know, just washing hands and all that is quite important. And because of water insecurity in many parts of the survey, this was a cause of a lot of worry and stress for the women. The farmers in the sample reported that their productivity suffered because the traditional ways or the usual ways that they accessed information, for example, in India, it was these self-help women groups, these have kind of disappeared during lockdown because, you know, people were not allowed to congregate and all that. And so losing that ability to get timely information was really critical for these farms. And that was really a source of lost productivity. And then finally, in terms of migration and care work, there was a sense that the households that had migrants were perceived or that depended on a lot of the migrants' remittances faced higher vulnerabilities because of the income loss on the migrant side. And then in some cases, the migrants came home and you know, you have another person to feed, but without the, you know, but with the income loss, it became kind of added sort of more stress for the household. Not surprisingly, as we said, care work just increased overall, partly because children had to stay home, partly because, you know, you used to be able to drop them off at the neighbors and now you couldn't. And also because of the returning migrants, coupled with, you know, you need to collect more water, more fuel, that sort of thing. And so just overall, this additional burden on care work was quite evident in the data. So this is just kind of highlights. I mean, a lot of the study is still ongoing. And so what I wanted to leave you with is just a whole bunch of resources where that describe a lot of the findings in greater detail. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. That was great. And please feel free to start populating the chat with questions. And I'll ask Mary to go ahead and share her screen. And commend Hazel for her incredible focus with all of the other things happening in her home office. Mary, when you're ready, go ahead and unmute yourself and take us through.
All right, thank you very much. I guess let me see if I can do this. If I unmute my screen, it's going to look like I'm not actually looking at you because I've got one of these funky screens. So I think I'll just leave it off for now and I'll turn it on as soon as I'm done speaking. But thank you everybody for being here. I know for some of you, it's probably ridiculously early in the morning. For some of you, it's probably ridiculously late at night. You know, but we're women and we're used to that. So I will confess that although I am delighted to be joining you here, that I have a little bit of imposter syndrome going on because I don't consider myself a scholar or even a researcher. I do some research, but it's extremely applied, and most of my time is spent on the ground, out in the field, literally helping women clear the pathway to their dreams and their most cherished ambitions, which has to do with, you know, starting and growing successful farms. So just a little bit of my background. The Women's Agricultural Network was started in 1994. We're very proud of it. As far as we can tell, it is the first university attempt to offer education and technical assistance to women farmers. And so that makes us the oldest and longest running program. We work throughout the US. Most of our work is based in the Northeast because we live in the state of Vermont. But because of the miracle of technology, we're able to actually attract audiences from throughout the US and even from some foreign countries. We focus on education and technical assistance, primarily organized around business development and planning. We try to stay away from some of the, a lot of the production information for some good reasons we can get into later during questions if you're interested. So one of the thought questions that we had for this conference was, you know, what strategies appear to be effective or ineffective in advancing more inclusive and locally relevant development activities, you know, and what questions could be shared between domestic and international gender and development communities. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and then we can certainly get into that in the questions a little bit more. But I'm going to start with something that I think everybody who's listening to my voice knows very well. Women are not a one-size-fits-all commodity. But sometimes when I review the literature that we have out there, when I speak with grad students, there's a tendency to want to speak in broad generalities and lump all of domestic agricultural happenings into, you know, this umbrella of U.S. farming and women in agriculture in the U.S. And I just want to take a few minutes to point out that we have some significant regional differences in the country that really change the focus of who's farming and what we're doing in farming. I would say just very, very quickly, the Northeast, where you see the red circles, the Northeast and the West Coast, that's where we see a lot of small scale diversified farms. We have, the farmers tend to be younger, they tend to be white, and this is the women that I'm talking about. In the Midwest, we seem to have in that green circle more of our traditional, conventional agriculture, more commodity farmers. They tend to be older, and they also tend to be widows who have inherited the land through the rite of passage and passing of their husbands. So that does skew some of the age data if you look at some of the census demographics. In the yellow circle, you see where we have a lot of our tribal communities, many of which are matrilineal in the way that the land passes. So again, you see a very skewed picture of how many farmers are in that region. That also tends to be ranching country. The farms tend to be very, very big and have many, many hundreds and thousands of acres to them. So, which is not the case at all. And then of course in the Southeast, we again see many smaller Black-owned farms, many crop farms, things like that. And so you see there's a lot of diversity even within the US that doesn't always get surfaced in the literature. The other way that you can slice and dice the information and the data and the research is of particular interest to me, and that has to do with where women are in their life spectrum and what kinds of life events are impacting their business decisions and what's happening. And again, you know, starting at the widows and matriarchs, this is where we begin to see women who are inheriting land. This is an audience where if we care about having land in the next generation and in the next 10, 15, 20 years in this country, we really need to be having conversations with this population. We need to be figuring out how to help these women translate a very difficult conversation, which is often, am I going to keep my land in farming, which is what I want to do, or am I going to ensure my own personal financial security so I don't have to be a burden to my family or the community? The next group we see is a group that I've had a lot of contact with, particularly in our earlier years, which are career changers. These are women in their 30s and 40s who are moving from careers, very often in healthcare, education, or business ownership, and moving into agriculture because it's almost a dream deferred for them. This is something that they really wanted to do all of their lives. They were told in high school and college it was not a career that was viable for women to even consider. So they went ahead and took a different path, and now they're coming back to the land. They have some cash to invest, they have some money. What they don't have is any concrete farm experience. So in that sense, they're starting at ground zero, and they are not good fits in general for internships or apprenticeship programs just because of their age and their family status. They're pretty stationary and they're not that mobile. The other group that I love working with and that I'm very excited to see growing by leaps and bounds, at least in the Northeast, is this cohort of young women who are coming out of college, sometimes with degrees in an agricultural science, but many times not, who have become career farmers. You know, they may have worked 1, 2, or 3 seasons on a farm, and now they've really caught the bug and they want to be farmers. And they have the reversed problem. They have a lot of on-the-ground experience, a lot of practical growing experience. They have a lot of youth and energy and good health on their side. The one thing they don't have is cash, and they're very often saddled with a lot of debt, especially those college grads. So those are just a couple of ways that I see that, you know, this category of women farmers can be sliced and diced a little bit so that we begin to get more granular pictures of who these people are. So finally, now I just want to talk about the pandemic. Last March, our food system in North America hit a wall. Actually, it was a global crisis, but my focus was on the US and even more specifically on the Northeast. We watched in horror as restaurants and institutions shut down. We saw orders canceled. We watched as the trucking and transportation industry sort of ground to a halt and store shelves started to empty. And then we saw our worst nightmare was the big slaughterhouses and processing facilities in the Midwest started to go offline. All for very good reasons, but there was a panic as we all tried to figure out how to patch together a food system that was going to keep people fed. We also had people thrown into economic crisis. We had jobs lost. We were being told to shelter at home. And this was the very first time for many, many Americans in the comfortable middle class that they had to actually confront food scarcity. And that was quite the wake-up call. So, thankfully, the most severe moments were relatively short-lived, but for many, the suffering continues and goes on even to this day. So, and that's why the research is going to lag a little bit behind, because when we first started talking about this conference almost a year ago now, we all thought this would be in our rearview mirror by now. And look, we're still right in the middle of it. So, in the span of 4 to 6 weeks, though, in this pandemic, we saw some really interesting things happen. We saw farmers markets shut down, and those farmers who were left without their markets pivoted almost overnight to online sales. When restaurants and institutions shut down and store shelves emptied out, many farmers in our area opened multi-product food hubs and became their own local regional grocery stores and started figuring out how to keep their friends and neighbors fed. We saw subscriptions for CSAs double and in some cases triple in the span of 2 and 3 and 4 weeks. Distilleries that were producing high-end craft whiskeys started pivoting to hand sanitizer almost overnight. I mean, it was really stunning. We saw chefs become experts at things like curbside pickup and home delivery, which, quite frankly, 3 months ago, before that, they would have turned their nose up. And they became emergency food shelves and providers for their colleagues and their former employees that were now at risk. So this was a real entrepreneurial moment for the record books, and it deserves a much closer look. And I really encourage all of us to start capturing these stories and figuring out what happened. And one of the reasons that I'm so fascinated by this is that this was an opportunity where the food system that we have, that so many of us have advocated for and embraced, that small scale local food system, actually was the underdog, but actually came out the winner because they were decoupled from this massive monoculture commodity system, they actually were able to come up ahead and to be winners. So another thing that has been occupying my brain for the last few months as I've been watching all of this is that, and this is a demographic that I am a part of, but this is the drivers right now of the small scale local food movement. These are home cooks, women over 40, professionals with disposable income who largely live within 300 to 400 miles of the farms that they support. And I am a card carrying member of this group. But my question is really, are we the problem or are we the solution? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a fascinating question. In terms of lessons learned, I think that once again, we saw small and local have some real advantages in a pandemic if the principal operators are willing to think creatively. We also learned that broadband and cellular networks are not optional luxuries. They are now utilities and pretty much are required. And we also saw, as Hazel mentioned, that women are still unfairly tasked with a lot of the home and family management that we, that takes up so much time and takes our attention away from our businesses. So I think I will go ahead and stop there so that we can get into some questions, but I left a few research considerations on the table and
Great.
I will turn it back.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. And in fact, we're going to probably pick up right where you left off in terms of research considerations. So we're going to do a couple questions, the dialogue back and forth between the three of us, and then please continue to populate the chat with some of your more specific questions. So as both Mary and Hazel, as you both alluded to, the pandemic has created a unique opportunity for research, both because it's that real-time live ability to reach out to people. And we have much clearer questions to ask too. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the research methods and approaches that have emerged, or that we're now relying on much more heavily in this period, and what we're learning about their effectiveness. And both of you have alluded to that. Hazel, you alluded a little bit to that in terms of phone surveys. So Hazel, do you want to go first, and then Mary can pick up after?
Yeah, so maybe let me start with the phone surveys, because I think the main concern is that there is a huge digital divide, and I don't know if people caught that sort of map of where the mobile access is, like by men and women, and there's just some regions where this is just a big gap. So that's a concern, but at the same time, it's like, what else do we have to collect the information, given that we need sort of right now timely information, because as people are struggling with the economic shocks, and this is rippling throughout the global economy, people need to do something right now, and we kind of just need any and all information to do these rapid surveys, rapid assessments, that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of potential in phone surveys, especially where we have already established sort of face-to-face rapport and interaction. So for example, I think where we see this most effective is really in places where our teams have already been working for a long time. So these are communities that know the researchers, that we've established kind of long-standing relationships. They know these interviewers over time. They've met them in person in the past, for example, and then they're just coming up and following up and sort of checking on how they are. So we think that that's kind of the most effective, or sort of most promising kind of approach. But then the other thing is that I didn't mention in my talk, but it was really important, is how do you ensure privacy? Because now we're especially on trying to get at gender impacts, we're really concerned about conflict. We're really concerned about distributional issues within the household and who's really bearing the brunt of the shock. But how do you know that a woman is speaking sort of in private and not on speakerphone? So the speakerphone issue actually turned out to be a really important thing. And our researchers, my colleagues who did the surveys, did something really clever, where the enumerators were given kind of a really sort of benign question to just determine if if the speakerphone is on. And so they would say something like, I just need to know, if, is there any chance you're on speakerphone, because I'm having problems with I need to change the setting on the connection if you do. And the change in setting is really not to ask the sensitive question, really, right? Because if sometimes, these women are not turning the phone on because they're multitasking, which is another reason why women might do that. But sometimes it's because in-laws or their husband kind of want to know who's talking to the wife and what the questions are and all that. And in that case, then there are just certain topics that are off limits. And so I think somebody asked a question around like IPV, and that's part of the reason why it's really difficult to ask questions that are really sensitive in a phone survey setting. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks. No, that's great. I think we tend to focus on the gap, and your point about the speakerphone was really just landed for me. How many times have we all been caught out on a phone call that we thought was more private than it actually was? And to think about that, during phone surveys. Mary, did you want to comment also on some of the research approaches and methods that you think are emerging, or some cautionary tales?
Sure. I will. I mean, everything Hazel said, yes, I think, but I will also say that our farmers are suffering severe survey fatigue right now. They are burned out. I had no less than 5 surveys come across my screen yesterday, granted all for different regions and for different things, and from really well-intended, well-meaning people. So, but I think that when we only have 2% of our country working in agriculture, and we have a lot more people people than that who are interested in knowing what's going on. I think we have to figure out ways to collaborate with one another as researchers, as extension agents, and figure out if there's ways that we can combine so that we go to the well a little bit less often and use up that social capital a little bit more judiciously with our farmers.
Great. I was listening, Mary, as you were talking about some of the disruptions in the food system sort of in the US. I was thinking so much of the work we do internationally around agriculture and gender issues, and this mantra or this idea that we, how do we get people connected to local markets, farmers connected to local markets? And during different periods of times, the connection to large global value chains has been a really big, important thing, or a strategy that people have lauded as being incredibly important. And even though we're in the middle of this pandemic still, I wanted to invite both of you to comment on whether there are specific strategies that you think are emerging that are particularly effective, or some things that we've seen that are really just ineffective in terms of, for building a more inclusive food system.
Would you like me to go first this time?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the $60 billion question right now, is when all is said and done and we finally are able to look back on this, are we as consumers going to learn from our lessons? Are we going to learn that monocultures, that centralized food systems are very vulnerable? Or are we just going to go back to our sort of Amazon one-click ship kind of 24-hour delivery kind of mentality? And that's the thing that we're watching very closely. Those of us that work in the marketing side of things are trying to figure that out. I hope, I'm an optimist by nature, and I'm really hoping that we are going to learn the value of having much more localized, much more regional food systems in place, and that there is, even though you may lose something in terms of how many varieties of Pop-Tarts you have on the shelf, you may gain something in terms of some peace of mind at night.
Thanks. So I don't know if this is going to answer your question or if I'm answering a different question, but I was just thinking, this is going to sound really basic, but I think even just making sure that all the responses take into account where the women are in the food system is really critical, because that sounds really fundamental, but honestly, my colleagues kind of did a review of all the immediate sort of responses, social protection responses, and they said, well, only 11% actually had any kind of limited gender sensitivity. And to me, that's really low. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. So I don't know what the actual intervention should be, but the point is that you kind of want to recognize that women are not just all in one place. They're not just producers, or they're not just all in this sector or that sector, that they're kind of really all across the system and have many different roles. And so just making sure that that's included in the planning. Yeah, I guess I'm really saying something really fun. So anyway, so that, I think that's where we are. The other thing I wanted to point to is that so there's like this paper that I include in my presentation around, is this a setback or is it an opportunity? And I think this, and they talk about, this is the Ragasa Lambrecht paper. They talk about like different kind of levels of value chain. There are global value chains, and there are these more local stuff. And it really depends where the women are. So if you're talking about this big flower sector, where this is really women dominated, and there's a way to sort of protect that sector, then that's going to really benefit the women who are in there. So I think that's just a really good kind of example to think through. Like, there are different ways to incorporate gender sensitivity in all our responses. And if we want better gendered outcomes and gendered impacts, then this is something everybody needs to pay attention to.
We're getting a lot of, thank you, both of you. We're getting a lot of comments about the interest in the intersection between the global South perspectives and the US perspectives. And so I think one of the questions that we had talked about wanting to explore together was that given that we have these two perspectives in the US and the global South, what comes to mind for both of you in listening to each other around the lessons that can be shared between domestic and international gender and development communities? Who wants to take that one first?
Well, I'm going to be brief because I think that advantages, disadvantages aside, I think one of the things that always seems to happen is that women are going to be saddled with a disproportionate share of the work anytime the systems in our life start to crumble. And I think it has been an incredibly hard time for women. And I don't even mean exclusively for the women farmers that I work with, because I see women at every stage along the food spectrum and the food system. And, they have had a really tough year trying to navigate making very low wages and then being called, essential employees and basically not having the opportunity to stay home, even though they had kids at home and no childcare. And so I think it has really highlighted once again the fact that the system is rigged against us, and we need to do some strategic work around how to either rebalance the scale or start a new scale.
I'm picking up on something really specific that Mary said, which is around survey fatigue. And I know, the researchers among us like to do a lot of surveys, but yeah, I mean, we kind of want to think about the research ethics on this too, is that we're going there trying to gather information, but are we, we kind of really want that balance of, is the information we're trying to get, at the frequency we want it, at the level of detail we want it, is it helping or harming, the respondents? And I think, if we keep that kind of top of mind as we kind of try to gather our data and all that, and try to influence these processes, policy responses and all that, I think we would just have kind of better outcomes overall. And like you said, like, the women are super, I mean, if they were busy before, like, try getting them to answer, like longer than a 15-minute questionnaire, right? So, I mean, yeah, there you go. That's my cue. So anyway, so I think that's certainly a lesson that cuts across both, regardless of where you're working or where your area of interest is.
Thanks. We have a question I'm going to turn over now to some of the questions that have been coming in the chat. And from Mary Rodriguez, we have, how have you seen the impact of COVID affecting women's physical, emotional, mental well-being with having to pivot with so much uncertainty? I think we're picking up on a thread here. How do you see the pandemic affecting their well-being and engagement in the agricultural sector over the long term? I don't know, Hazel, if you want to, did we, in the surveys that you talked about, was any of that addressed specifically in questions?
No. I think we're concerned about long-term impacts, because some of the things that you do now, so for example, pulling kids out of school, or, like if the girls have to stay home from school because of these mobility restrictions, then that has sort of these intergenerational longer term consequences. And that's really concerning. The problem is that, I mean, we're a year into the pandemic. We haven't really had enough time to kind of observe how this plays out in the longer run. I mean, this is definitely top of mind. We want to pay attention to it, but I'm not sure we have the answers yet. So yeah, so no, I don't have a good answer. Sorry.
Mary, any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I will just say that for whatever reason, very, very, very few of the clients I work with actually contracted COVID. And I suspect it's because they were moving too fast and the virus couldn't catch up with them, or because they were isolated on a farm and staying away from people by and large, and sort of doing the right thing. But I think the thing that it has highlighted is for all of us is that, at least in this country, our healthcare system is absolutely fundamentally broken. People who need it the most are being marginalized and not getting the care that they need, and that's a tragedy by any measure.
This is a question. I have a question coming in from Larry Vaughn that's addressed to you, Mary, but I think, Hazel, you may have some thoughts on this too. So it says, Mary, is there a risk of local producers losing the ground that they have gained? Are there research questions to help anticipate and react to any such changes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a risk that we will return to what business as usual. And I think that if we're going to do research, it probably has to happen on the consumer side and not on the farm side of the gate. Because the consumers, quite frankly, will hold all the cards and all the power in this particular platform.
Yeah, on losing ground, I just wanted to go back to the education question, because I mean, over the last decade, we've, globally, we've been gaining ground on women's education, closing that gap, and really getting women kind of be in the workforce. And if, globally, there's this sort of just backsliding of those gains, then we're going to see that play out, in the next generation, in the near future, maybe even not in the next generation, but soon, like sooner than we think.
Again, I have another question that's actually directed to Mary, but I also think Hazel may have some thoughts on this from the Global South. With people losing jobs, do you see an increase in the number of small farmers or female agripreneurs? I suppose the version of that, Hazel, is, does this create an opportunity in some way for women to gain ground in agriculture? But I'll let you think about that as Mary tackles the question. Let me know if you want me to repeat it, Mary.
Well, I will tell you that we have seen we have a sort of a beginning farmer program, which is kind of like Farming 101. And we have seen a tremendous increase in interest in that. And we, in fact, had to offer a second section of the class because it outgrew what we could offer. Many of them, the other thing is that we have seen a real shift. A lot of urban people, a lot of people from Boston area, New York City area moved to Vermont and bought land to escape sort of the COVID lockdown situation. And so we have a lot of people who are very new to living in the country who have great ambition. I think it's way too early in the game to see whether it's going to actually come to fruition. But yes, the answer is yes, we have seen a lot of interest in people. Gardening has gone through the roof. People are, partly because we're just all home, and partly because we saw the store shelves empty out in 48 hours. And so now we finally realize that, there are worse things than learning how to grow your own food.
Yeah. So I think that the answer could be yes, if, and, under certain conditions, yes, it could be an opportunity. I think it will need to, I think if there's an opportunity, women will take it, as long as there are no other barriers, right? Like if they need, if they've lost all their savings and they have no capital to start a new business, or how are they going to do that? So I think if we combine, so for example, have some programs that that provide credit in favorable terms to these small businesses that are women run, or this kind of thing, then that will go a long way to making sure that the entrepreneurs who do want to take that forward have enough support to be able to do something. Because otherwise, the opportunity is there, but who really, I know. Yeah, who who has the ability to take those opportunities forward could be a very select group of people. And so if we want that spread around, we want to make sure they're supporting policies. Anyway, yeah, this happens to me in all my, so everybody, this is what it's like to meet with me. So they just come with a package. They're just, it depends on the time. So it's lunchtime, as you heard.
We love to hear all the voices. You know, I think we're actually at time in order to give the 5-minute for transitions. You know, I think what you were just saying, Hazel, was reminding me of some of the survey work that's come out of TechnoServe in terms of one of the things that this exposed were those underlying inequalities that we're desperately trying to close under normal circumstances. And because some of them are so stark and deep, when we face a crisis, it's not just managing the day-to-day, it's the, we don't want to lose ground in terms of the way men and women are able to build and grow and take advantage of opportunities that may present themselves. I would like to thank both of you for today and for this great conversation. And also thank everybody who popped in their questions. And I think I'm supposed to turn it over to Erin possibly, or somebody else from the facilitation team at this point to close us out. Thanks so much again, Hazel and Mary, and the rest of your family, Hazel.
Amazing.
Thanks so much.
Hazel, Mary, Cristina, and the happy homes behind all of you. It was fabulous. And Cristina, thank you. Thank you for jumping over. Folks, take a look, navigate to Zoom chat. We like to make this easy on you. Please transition back to the main room with me. We're headed there and it's fast. It is a 5-minute jump. So please at 11:50, mark it 11:50. We're giving you a few extra minutes. So what that means is you get to go take a quick break. So take a quick stretch and then jump back. And what's going to happen? We'll do some quick awards and then we will move to our final round of facilitated conversations. So please go ahead, say goodbye, and we will see you back in plenary in just a moment. And as you depart, you'll notice on the screen, we have the graphic recording that's been done by Lauren Green. And that will be, as promised, it will be in the daily reports and available for everyone. In closing.
Right.
Thank you. And yes, Valeska, good point. Continue the conversation. I'm seeing lots of realizations, epiphany moments, all the things. That's awesome. Could you please make sure you copy and paste that and put that in the discussion forums? Go to community and let's keep this conversation going. We appreciate you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.